Well, hi there, and welcome back to Her Shrink Ray Eye. I'm Joan Biediger, and today I want to talk about something that sounds impossible at first. How can a silent miniature make noise? I'm not talking about a miniature with a speaker hidden under the base, or a model railroad layout with engine sounds, or even a diorama that plays battlefield sound effects. Those can be interesting in their own way, but that isn't really what I'm thinking about today. This episode is about a different kind of sound, the kind suggested by the work itself, without any actual sound effects. Think about standing in front of a small scene where nothing is moving. No light is flickering, no motor running, no sound comes from the object at all. And yet, the scene somehow has an acoustic presence. A narrow machine room seems to hum. A neon sign over a miniature storefront suggests a faint buzz, even if the sign is only painted plastic. That's the experience I want to stay with. A miniature that remains completely silent, but still seems to carry sound. I think many of us have felt this without necessarily naming it. We look at a miniature, read the objects, and sense the kind of world those objects belong to. We know almost instantly that glass would ring differently than wood, gravel would sound different from snow, a metal door in a basement corridor would not close the same way as a bedroom door with a rug underneath it. None of those sounds are actually present in the room. The miniature is still silent, but the sounds we imagine have a source. They come from memory, from experience, from the way we know materials behave, from the way we know spaces change sound, from all the small acoustic lessons we have absorbed over a lifetime without thinking about them very much. Perception is strange like that. When we look at a miniature, I don't think vision is working by itself. When the work gives us enough to go on, the mind starts drawing on other kinds of knowledge. A bell caught at the top of its swing does not have to ring for us to understand the sound attached to it. That is one reason miniature work can become much more than representation. A miniature does not have to produce a sound in order to make us listen. It only has to show us enough for sound to feel possible. And that changes the kind of questions we might ask at the bench. Instead of only asking whether a scene looks believable or whether the story reads clearly, we might ask something quieter and more specific. What does this place sound like? Would the floor creak? Would water drip? Would machinery be humming in the background? Would one small object falling from a table seem loud enough to change the whole scene? Or maybe the more powerful question is the opposite. What sound has just stopped? Because some miniatures seem loud, seem full of motion, impact, weather, voices, engines, or the possibility of something breaking. Other miniatures seem silent in a way that feels active, not empty, silent, like the moment after a door has closed or after the last person has left a room. In some cases, the sound we imagine may be more powerful than the one an artist could actually add. I want to begin with the ordinary logic of sound. Sound begins with an event. Most sounds are not free-floating sensations. They tell us that something has happened. A surface has been struck. An object has been put under pressure. Maybe water has landed on something hard, soft, or absorbent. Sound gives us information about an event and often about the materials involved in that event. This is why we can recognize so much from sound alone. If something falls in another room, we may not know exactly what object fell, but we often know what kind of surface it hit. Ceramic on tile has a different sharpness than wood on carpet. A door closing in a stone corridor carries through the space differently than a cabinet door closing in a kitchen. We are constantly learning those relationships, usually without thinking of them as knowledge. Miniature work can use that knowledge because a silent scene can show the cause of a sound. A coin dish with coins scattered around it suggests the clatter that just happened. Think about a wall-mounted pencil sharpener with shavings below it. It suggests a small, grinding sound, hand-turned and repetitive. Small details can point towards contact, impact, repetition, or vibration. Atmosphere is a useful word, and miniature artists use it for good reason, but it can be a little broad sometimes. A scene can feel atmospheric because of light, color, subject matter, or mood. Sound asks for something more specific. It asks for a cause. Something has struck a surface or changed the state of a material. A silent miniature does not become audible because the viewer invents sound out of nothing. It becomes audible when the scene gives the viewer enough to recognize what kind of sound belongs there. Silent images associated with familiar sounds do not seem to remain purely visual in the brain. In some studies, they activate parts of the auditory system even when no sound is being played. One of the most useful studies for this episode is a study called When a Photograph Can Be Heard. It was published in Scientific Reports in 2011 by Alice Proverbio and colleagues. The researchers showed people silent photographs, some strongly associated with sound and others not. The sound-related images included a barking animal, a musical instrument, coins, tools, and other objects that most people would connect with a familiar sound. What they found was that sound-related photographs activated auditory areas of the brain very quickly, even though no sound was being played. The viewer was not hearing an actual external sound. The image itself was silent, but the brain was not treating the image as purely visual either. When the photograph carried a strong sound association, the auditory system became part of the response. A related study by Casper Meyer, Jonas Kaplan, and colleagues, published in Nature Neuroscience in 2010, found something similar from a slightly different angle. When people viewed silent images that implied sounds, activity in the auditory cortex of the brain carried information about the kind of sound involved. Animals, musical instruments, and objects did not all produce the same pattern. The auditory cortex was not simply waking up in a general way. It seemed to preserve something about the kind of sound the image suggested. The limitation of these studies is important. These studies were not done with three-dimensional miniatures. They used photographs and silent visual stimuli. So I would not claim that the science proves every silent miniature activates the auditory cortex. That would be way too strong a statement. But the research does support a principle that applies well here. A visual image associated with a familiar sound can recruit auditory memory and auditory processing. That gives us a much richer foundation than saying a miniature has atmosphere. The miniature may be using the same kind of learned relationship between sight and sound that we use constantly in ordinary life. When we see a dog's body braced forward with the mouth open, we know that the bark belongs to that posture. We see a handbell raised mid-swing, and we know that motion has a sound attached to it. We've heard these kind of events before. That is also why some silent objects feel louder than others. A generic barrel in the corner may not carry much sound by itself, but one dented inward near a loading dock begins to suggest impact. A tool resting on a bench may suggest work in a general way. A tool caught mid-strike gives the mind a more specific event. For the maker, that research is useful because it gives implied sound a practical footing. It suggests that implied sound is not only metaphor, it is connected to how perception already works. The mind has stored relationships between objects, materials, actions, and sounds. A miniature can call on those relationships when the visual evidence is specific enough. The surprising part is not that the viewer imagines a sound. The surprising part is that the sound may already be built into the act of looking. A silent miniature can expose how much listening is hidden inside vision. So the useful question is whether the scene gives the viewer a recognizable sound event, a source, a material, a gesture, or a moment where contact is about to happen, has just happened, or keeps repeating somewhere in the background. That is when a silent miniature begins to feel audible. Part of the reason this subject is so interesting to me is that I have a strange relationship with certain kinds of background noise. Sometimes a fan will start as a fan. The shower will start as water hitting tile. Nothing unusual is happening in the room. Then the sound seems to organize itself into a melody. It's not music playing somewhere else in the house. I've had to turn off the shower or fan at times because the music sounds so distinct. I think it really is in the house. The phenomenon is called auditory pareidolia. It is comparable to the visual phenomenon of seeing faces or familiar objects in clouds. I've had this happen often enough that it's made me think differently about perception. The fan is still a fan. The shower is still a shower. But the experience is not only the raw sound. My mind works on it and begins to make music or conversation out of it. Hearing music in a fan or shower is not the same thing as implied sound in miniature. In this case, there is actual sound in the room, and the mind is organizing it into something more structured. With the miniature, the starting point is visual, but the connection is still useful. Both experiences demonstrate how actively involved our brains are in creating an understanding of our surroundings. We can take incomplete or ambiguous information and make it feel more organized than the stimulus itself. Some miniature effects work in that first instant before analysis takes over, when the viewer recognizes something, even if they don't consciously identify it. That's why the fragility of those connections is also part of the effect. Implied sound works best when the scene suggests enough, and then leaves the viewer alone with it. Once implied sound becomes part of the question, some objects become much louder than others. The research on sound-associated images points in that direction. The strongest responses tend to come from things with a very recognizable sound attached to them. Typically, the object has to be shown in a condition where sound makes sense. A hammer striking a surface, a musical instrument being played, maybe it's a machine that appears to be running. That difference in the state of an object is important. A violin resting in a case may suggest music in a general way, but a bow drawn across the strings gives the mind a specific event. Similarly, a bell hanging still may be symbolic. A bell pulled slightly off center with the clapper visible begins to imply movement and ring. In visual work, the loudest silent objects are often the ones that carry a clearly defined relationship between material and action. Glass is particularly effective because we know how easily it turns from object into event. Metal brings another register. Clink, scrape, ring, grind. A few keys on a hook suggest one kind of sound. A dropped wrench suggests another. The material makes the sound easier to recognize. Machines work differently because their sound often lasts. A fan behind a wire guard, a transformer box, a compressor, maybe an old fluorescent fixture does not need dramatic action. These objects suggest hum, buzz, drone, or vibration, the kind of background sound people stop noticing until it shuts off. Specificity does the work. A vague, noisy mood is weaker than one object placed where its sound makes sense. When the object, material, and action belong together, the viewer recognizes the sound more quickly. We spend a lot of time thinking about how material looks at small scale. Is the metal convincing? Does the wood grain read correctly? Those are familiar questions at the bench, but the material is not only visual, it changes what we think we would hear. Metal produces sharp ringing and scraping sounds. Wood produces creaking. Paper produces rustling. Most sounds are muffled or softened by snow. Stone conveys sound differently than dirt does. In miniature work, material sound usually appears through contact. A drip is not just a drip. Water landing in a shallow pan gives one kind of repeated sound. Water landing on cloth gives another. And water disappearing into soil almost erases itself. Sound depends on what receives it. This also gives us a way to think about high and low sound without turning the scene into an acoustics lesson. Thin, hard materials often suggest sharper, higher sounds, like keys, glass, and cutlery. Heavier materials suggest lower or duller sounds, maybe stone, machinery, packed earth. The effect is not absolute, but it gives the artist another layer to work with. A miniature can feel acoustically convincing even when nothing in it is moving because things like walls, floors, ceilings, and any number of surfaces tell us what sound would do there. A figure standing in a tiled washroom belongs to a different sound world than the same figure standing on packed dirt in a forest. Sound questions can add another dimension to miniature art. The question is not only whether the materials look realistic, but whether they behave like materials. Do they have weight? Do they show contact? Do they suggest what would happen if someone dropped, opened, dragged, or touched something inside the scene? When material behaves convincingly, sound comes closer. The miniature remains silent, but the materials give the viewer a clearer sense of how sound would behave there. The same footstep changes depending on whether it lands in a narrow hallway, a tiled kitchen, a carpeted room, or a snow-covered street. The source matters, but the space can change the character of the sound also. Miniature artists already think about space visually. We think about the size of the room, the placement of the figure, the opening, the light source, the depth, and the way the viewer reads the scene. But sound adds another question. What would this space do to the sounds inside it? Enclosure matters here, but not in the same way as a viewing window or a box diorama opening. A closed room holds sound. A long corridor can stretch it out. A high ceiling lifts it. A low ceiling presses it downward. A partially open door can make a sound seem as if it's coming from somewhere else, even when that somewhere else is only implied. A miniature does not need to build the whole environment to suggest how sound would behave there. A few tiled walls and a drain can make water sound sharper. Snow along the edge of a road can change the whole sound of the scene because snow is not only visual, it changes the way the world carries sound. A setting is not just where the figure stands, it is the condition that changes everything the figure does. When a miniature feels as though it has sound, part of that sound comes from the object, part from the material, and part from the space that tells us how sound would behave. Sound is not only a source or a material, it can also be a pattern. A scene may not contain anything obviously loud, but the arrangement can still suggest rhythm. A flight of stairs, fence posts, railroad ties, boot prints, or pipes running along a wall can create expectations. The eye moves from one to the next, and that movement can begin to feel almost beat-like. Perfect repetition is not always the strongest. The rhythm becomes more active when something interrupts it. Maybe it's one tool missing from a neat row, maybe a broken tile. Disturbance often carries sound. Repeated marks can feel alive because they show us over time. Scratches around a latch, soot above a vent, crumbs below a bakery slicer. These are not single dramatic events, they're traces of repetition. Sometimes the question is not what made the loudest noise. Sometimes the question is what keeps happening here? What repeats in this space often enough that the miniature begins to carry its rhythm? Some miniatures seem loud because they imply impact, weather, machines, voices, animals, or movement. But there's another possibility that may be even more interesting. Some miniatures feel silent, not empty, not simply still, silent in a way that feels active. Emptiness and silence are not the same experience. An empty scene may feel unfinished or underbuilt if it gives us too little to work with. A silent scene can feel full of information. It can suggest that sound has been removed, muffled, or withheld. The viewer senses that the world of the miniature should contain sound, and the absence becomes part of the meaning. Recent research on silence gives this idea a firmer footing. In a 2023 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Ru Zi Go, Chaz Firestone and Ian Phillips looked at whether people perceive silence as more than a simple lack of sound. They adapted auditory illusions so that the critical events were periods of silence inside soundscapes. The finding was fascinating because the silences produced timing distortions similar to the ones produced by actual sounds. That suggests structured silence can be perceived as an event rather than only as a gap. A radio with its cord pulled from the wall is not quiet in the same way as a table with no radio on it. A school hallway after everyone has gone home is not quiet in the same way as an empty hallway in a new building. The difference is expectation. The scene carries the memory of sound or the evidence that sound recently belonged there. I think this is one reason some quiet miniatures stay with us for a long time. They don't simply show a lack of activity. They make us aware of what is no longer happening. A dark workshop with tools left in place can suggest all the ordinary sounds of making, precisely because they have stopped. A figure standing in a room can feel silent if the room seems built for voices that are no longer present. This kind of silence can be hard to build. If a scene contains no cues, no tension, no history of use, and no reason to expect sound, silence may not register as silence at all. It may simply feel blank. But when the scene suggests sound and then withholds it, the quiet becomes almost physical. This gives us another bench question, and I think it's a strong question. What sound has just stopped? That question can change how a scene is built. Instead of adding more objects, the maker has to choose what remains. The turned off radio, the closed piano lid, the door that has just finished moving, even if no one is there to open or close it now. A silent miniature can make noise by implying sound, but it can also make silence by implying the sound that should have been there. Eventually, the obvious question appears. If a miniature can suggest sound, why not add the real thing? People have experimented with sound in miniature worlds for a long time. Model railroads use engine sounds, whistles, and ambient layout noise. Museums and installations sometimes use soundscapes to deepen the experience of an object or environment. A diorama could include a hidden speaker, a loop of rain or machinery or music connected to the mood of the piece. I really understand the appeal of that. Sound can pull people in quickly. It can make a small world feel more immersive. If it's subtle and well matched to the subject, it may add another layer of atmosphere and attention. Research on museum soundscapes suggests that congruent sound can increase engagement, but the word congruent is doing a lot of work there. Sound has to belong to the object, the space, and the visitor experience. Generic sound or overly loud sound can work against attention instead of supporting it. Real sound is harder in miniature work because sound does not automatically shrink with the object. A tiny room can suggest a faint radio, a ticking clock, or distant street noise very convincingly in the mind. But once an actual speaker plays that sound into the full-sized room, the scale can change. The object has been reduced, but the sound has entered the viewer's room at full size. That can make a tiny window with rain behind it feel less like a miniature world and more like a device. The sound may be correct in subject, but wrong in size, distance, volume, or physical presence. That does not mean real sound should never be used. It means real sound changes the category of the piece. The miniature is no longer only a visual object. It becomes closer to a small installation. And installations have to think about the room around them. Sound travels. It bleeds into neighboring work. It affects people who did not choose to engage with that particular piece. Unlike a visual detail, sound cannot always be ignored simply by turning your head. That may be one reason the miniature community has mixed feelings about it. The resistance is not necessarily old-fashioned. It may come from an accurate sense that real sound can overpower the scale, narrow the interpretation, and disturb the quiet concentration that miniatures often depend on. Real sound can be powerful when it's restrained, localized, and genuinely necessary. A very low ambient sound in a controlled installation might work beautifully. A soundscape designed from the rhythm and material logic of the scene might support the work rather than decorate it. The important point is that sound should not be added because the visual scene failed to suggest it. If the only way a miniature can feel like rain, machinery, crowd noise, or silence is through a speaker, then the sound may be compensating for something the scene has not yet solved. The more interesting challenge may be to make the miniature audible before any sound is added. The rain through surface and gutter, the machinery through vibration and repetition, the silence through what has stopped, and the clatter through the objects left behind. Real sound can add to a piece, but implication protects something important. It keeps the sound at the same scale as the scene because the sound is formed in the imagination, not projected into the room. That may be why a silent miniature can sometimes be more convincing than a noisy one. The silence gives the viewer room to listen. A silent scene can suggest the clatter of metal, the drip of water into a pan, the low hum of machinery, or the strange quiet after something has stopped. It can do that through objects, materials, surfaces, rhythm, and space. None of these details needs to announce themselves. In fact, the strongest ones often do the opposite. They sit quietly inside the scene and let the viewer recognize them. When we build a scene, we often ask whether it reads visually. Does the composition work? Is the story clear enough? Are the materials believable? Those questions still matter, but we might add one more. What does this place sound like? Not as a gimmick, not as an instruction to add electronics, just as another way of examining whether the scene has entered the viewer's experience deeply enough. A miniature can be completely still and still suggest a world in motion. It can be silent and still carry sound. It can make the viewer aware of contact, weight, distance, and absence. It can remind us that looking is rarely only visual, especially when the object in front of us is small enough to hold but large enough to feel like a place. That may be one reason miniature art can do so much with so little. It does not give us the whole sound. It gives us the object, the surface, the space, the pause after something's happened. And when those choices are right, the viewer begins to listen. Maybe a silent miniature makes noise when it leaves just enough for the viewer to listen. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, follow, or share it with someone else who thinks about miniature art, perception, or what happens at the bench. And I'll be right here with my lamp on, brush in hand, story waiting. And before I sign off today, I want to thank the Shepherd Payne Education Fund for their support of this podcast and their continuing commitment to education in the miniature arts. Until next time, keep your hands steady, see clearly, not obediently, and keep your story your own.